Okay, so as with many of the techniques we do in here, this technique could be your only technique. It's a very powerful technique. There's ways to explore it, but when like, again, reminder, this is not a Buddhist class, it's totally secular, but a lot of these practices were taught in religious context. When the Buddha said, life is suffering, and what's the source of suffering? Desire. He was suggesting that a practice like this could be useful. Right now, we can start thinking of desire as a bad thing that way. But really, what is meant by that is when we are unconsciously desiring, when we identify with our desires, we end up in suffering. When we're awake to our desires, and we have conscious desires, awakened desires, then they cease to, we cease to identify with them. And you can start to watch their suffering drain out of them. So a very powerful practice to go to the basic level of desire, whatever you might call that, plus or minus, the very initial reaction. And today we were just taking a broad scan, but as you got more and more focused and concentrated, you could notice more and more subtle levels of negative and positive, and when they arise, and catch them just as they arise. What you're doing there is you're going to the very source of identity and suffering. So this is a very powerful practice. For allowing you to become awake to the structure of your, really the structure of your world. As we structure our world by good and bad mostly. When I look through this room, the things that will catch my attention will be the good ones or the bad ones. The more good they are, the more attention I'll grab. The more bad they are, the more attention I'll grab. So in the universe of things I could attend to, everything's getting filtered by proportional to how good or bad I think it is. And so the world I live in is the world that I am evaluating. I'm looking for the very good ones and the very bad ones. And everything else sort of drops into the background. So when we observe our structure of plus minus, which by the way, as you start to notice, is not the structure of plus minus, because it can even change for you in a few seconds. So that's not the structure, but it's a structure that you live within. When we start to observe that, we're observing, again, our own construction of our life. And the construction of our suffering. So I want to switch gears here a little bit. I just want to talk a little bit about a very particular part of our plus minus structure, which is our fear. And so the most important part of this type of meditation, as with any meditation, is the acceptance part, right? And so there's a deep temptation to apply to not accept, right? To be going, oh, I am uncovering minus, which I do not accept, right? And so what you'd be doing there is just practicing your suffering rather than accepting the minus. Plus minus is the best I could do. We could use, yin yang or something like that. But you want to be able to observe the plus and the minus not from a non-attached state or from an accepting state, or we can even go further, from a loving state, ideally. And let's just talk about fear as an example. You can disidentify from your fear in multiple ways. One is called dissociation, and it's very effective, but not very healthy in the long run. It can be very healthy in a short run, and depending what's happening. If something really bad's happening, it can actually be really useful. That's why it's in our body. But in the long run, if that becomes our habitual method of dealing with our fear, we're not going to heal the fear. The fear will just continue growing inside of us. But there are multiple other ways to work with our fear, but we have to be, but in general, how do we interact with our fear? And something to ask yourself, what is your relationship with your fear? What is your attitude towards your fear? Put it really simply, is fear plus or minus? When I'm in a fearful experience, if I'm afraid of this phone, which I should be probably, if I'm afraid of this cell phone, right, then the experience of the cell phone is a minus experience. That's how fear works, right? Fear goes minus, that's minus over there. But now, is the fear itself plus or minus? For most of us, it's minus. That's just true for most of us. See, when a fear arises, we want to get out of it. So we don't like that experience. Totally natural, totally normal. So how do we generally try to heal our fear? We just get rid of the scary things. Right? And that's an important part of life, especially if the scary thing is like hot poker or a lion or a violent person. There's useful, fear is saying get this out of your life, and that's fine, that's useful. But there's more chronic fear that we have. And it won't be healed by changing your life. It's been, I think you've probably proven that to yourself already. I keep getting scared, even though I keep running away. So we have to accept this minus experience to heal it. Minus. What I mean by that, just that we don't like it. We have to accept this experience we don't like. When we do that, we will change it from a minus experience. It will ultimately become a plus experience. But how do we do that? Well, first we have to non-identify with it. So we have to be able to be there with it. But let's just be very human about this. I mean, I like to use the example of the kid who's terrified of the monster under the bed. I think you've heard that many times. So let's do it as an adult. If you're really, really scared about something and you tell someone close in your life and they react like, I don't like you being scared, stop it. Or they get angry, or they get frustrated, or they get scared, or they get avoidant, or they dissociate, right? Do any of those things help you with your fear? You just ask yourself, you just know, like, no, none of that makes me feel better, right? All those are natural responses, by the way. We shouldn't judge people too harshly for those responses. Why? Because that's what we do to ourselves, right? We don't like our fears, so why would we expect to like someone else's fear? Unless we're some kind of sadist or something, but it doesn't help. It doesn't help. It is not healing. It's not supportive. So when we notice, oh, that doesn't work, it's not helpful. We can judge it, of course. Now we can get all mad at them, and we can have our own minus experience of them. But we can do the same thing. But we can notice, importantly, what it is we need to give ourselves. So at the human level, we need to change our perspective. At the human level, we need to come up with a different narrative around our fear. What does our fear want? That is, what would give it a sense of, what would help? Well, if another person said, well, explain to me in detail what you're scared of, that might help. Or if it's even too scary to talk about, they might just hug you or hold you or just sit with you. If they didn't in no way judge you for being afraid, right? You get a sense that they still love you just as much, even though you're scared. They still want to be with you just as much, even though you're scared. They still, they're patient and interested and caring, right? That's all going to help. And the deeper the fear, the longer that kind of relationship would need to be there for it to heal, but it's moving in the right direction. And this is why we go to therapists or spiritual teachers. I mean, it was one part of why we go, is because if they're good at what they're doing, they are accepting you the way you are. And you can feel that. You're like, oh, they're okay with me having this emotion. And if they are good at that, I mean, look, you can do this artificially and it can be helpful. Like you can get trained to just go, tell me more about that. And that can be helpful because it's so opposite of what we were used to getting. You can still be like, okay, this person's not totally shutting me out and running away. Great. You know what I mean? But to get real help there, the deepest people who are helpful, the deepest people who've been helpful to me, mostly spiritual teachers, but other people just in life, are people who are accepting of their own fear. So they're non-judgmental of their own internal emotional structure, so that they can do that for me or for whoever. So what is an alternative narrative? There's numbers of them, right? Well, one is, again, the inner child narrative. Just if a child comes up to you scared, it's much easier to be compassionate. Or a little puppy, or a little baby, or a little kitten. So you can just change the picture you have of your fear. And this is very important when you work with yourself or with anyone else, honestly. Especially in a close relationship. If your partner is behaving in a way that you can tell it's coming from fear, but it's really not understandable, it's useful to at least sometimes have a perspective. Oh, there's this part of them that is young and scared. Makes it a little easier, as long as you don't get into condescension. But see, condescension doesn't work with children either. So it's actually kind of important when we tell a story of an inner child. There isn't a sense in which we see something that inner child does not see. That's true. Or it can be true. But to heal the inner child, one has to fully respect the point of view of that child, understand why it's there, not intellectually, but that, oh yeah, that makes sense, right? There's a sense to it. I get why you're scared. And somebody gets why you're scared, that helps immediately. And just think about why that helps. It's just very, very basic. I'm scared. There's something dangerous out there. If nobody gets why I'm scared, no one's going to be able to help me. We're social creatures. We expect our tribe to help us. Nobody's understanding what I'm saying. How terrifying that adds on top of it, right? So we need to do that for ourselves. Understand that makes sense why that fear is here. And sometimes we don't understand. Actually, a lot of the time we don't understand. We need to start with so there's another narrative that can be useful, just realizing that fear doesn't get put into a person's body unless there was a reason. And at the time, it was a good reason. That's just how it happened. Now, look, there's every now and then we'll have a biological twist where we're just, our cortisol is going off, or like, and then the fear is not intellectually understandable. It's just biologically understandable. That can happen. But for the vast majority of us, if we're having a regular kind of fear, it got put into our body because of an actual understandable reason. Then maybe we can we may never uncover it, or we may not ever get it from the other person, but we can tell ourselves, of course, there's a good reason why they're scared, even if I don't know what it is. And we tell ourselves that about ourselves. And we could take that a step further. And we can kind of appreciate the fear mechanism and love it, right? It's there, like, oh, thank you for being here. You're protecting me. You're protecting this person. You're protecting me. I don't really know the story, but the word Cassandra is coming to mind, which is from I can't remember the play or the myth, but she was the prophet or the oracle that saw bad things coming in the future. And we can think we have a Cassandra in us, and we as humans, we don't love to hear, we don't like the bearer of bad news, right? And that's how we feel about our fear sometimes. But even if they're not accurate in the ultimate scheme of things, they are communicating what they're communicating because they see something. They see something in the world, or because they learned something in the world. We have to love and appreciate that and realize, I've talked about this with anger recently, so the same thing applies here. You don't have to believe the things that fear says to understand, appreciate, care about, and love it, right? So fear will almost always say false things because the mind says false things. But it doesn't mean it didn't have a good reason for being there. And in many ways, if fear is coming up a lot, there's information about your own structure that is asking to be integrated into your life. The fear that's on the surface is just the tip of the iceberg, and it leads down into a much bigger structure that guides all our choices. So until we're willing to accept the fear that's on the surface and love it, we won't be invited into the underneath structure, the substructure of our choices. And we'll never be free of them. So we notice plus and minus on the surface with equal love and affection for both, and acceptance. Because that is the structure of our life, is that plus minus structure. And until we're willing to accept that both sides, there's aspects of the plus that we don't like either. We're like, why do I think that's good? Okay, that can happen too. That's another conversation. You need to accept both of these to get invited into your structure. Okay, that's all I have to say today. Facebook, thanks for coming by. YouTube, thanks for coming by.